Tonight we look at the story that has been told about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey and why so many think her parents guilty, and what this tells us about the America she so briefly lived in.
My hypothesis was that I think the Ramseys came home at around 9:30, 10 o'clock. I think JonBenet was asleep. I think John did carry her upstairs.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is episode 49, the penultimate episode in the series, and it deals with the CBS documentary, The Case of JonBenet Ramsey. This was obviously a very controversial documentary after the fact. And I have to say I was very interested in watching it as someone who just published my first book on the JonBenet Ramsey case called The Craven Silence. And that would turn out to be the first book in a trilogy and also the first trilogy in 3 trilogies. But I was very interested to see what they were going to come up with in this documentary. There was quite a lot of marketing beforehand about the sets that they were building that would be a duplicate of the Ramsey home. And then there was also like a dream team of experts that had been assembled. And then there was also talk of brand new evidence. So all of this promised to be incredible. It promised to really take the case forward, and there seemed to be something that was going to be absolutely groundbreaking about this particular series. Now, in case I wasn't absolutely clear in the previous episode, it felt as though the interview on Dr. Phil that Burke did was actually meant to get in front of this particular documentary and almost take the wind out of its sails in terms of some of the allegations, some of the discussion. So in effect, you really had Burke going on Dr. Phil, basically dismissing, minimizing certain aspects that were going to come up in this documentary. I don't think it's any coincidence that the documentary would eventually have Burke Ramsey in its crosshairs, and the fact that Burke Ramsey came out of the fog, the murk, of the aftermath of the Ramsey case for the first time ever, about just a couple of days before this documentary aired. Now, although I want to review and essentially criticize this theory that is presented in this documentary, I want to also give it a balanced review. So I want to start off by talking about the aspects of it that I thought were strengths, things that I thought were assets to the documentary. I don't want to just sort of criticize it and say it was no good, because that's not the case. What I want to do is provide a balanced review. And so the first sort of half of this episode will be looking at some of the strengths, some of the interesting arguments, and then the second half will deal with the criticisms and why some aspects of it don't really go anywhere and probably needed to be more anchored in evidence or in logic, I guess, or even the dynamics of child psychology. I just want to be quite explicit just to say that the episodes that are on YouTube have been viewed, part 1 has been viewed over 5 million times and has got over 34,000 likes and less than 2,000 thumbs down. So that shows to what extent the public have been supportive of this documentary. And the second episode, part 2, has been viewed over 2.5 million times and has 18,000 thumbs up and less than 1,000 thumbs down. So I think that's quite important to bear in mind. If I'm going to offer some criticism, I think it's important to bear in mind that the public, by and large, seem to accept and seem to support this documentary, which I think is quite interesting. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. Thank you very much to the 100 or so of you who have subscribed since the last video, and also to the dozen or so who've joined Patreon since the last video. In the 50th episode, I'll give you a little bit of information on another series on JonBenet that you can look at, and where this commentary will go forward from the end of the 50th episode. In other words, at the end of the series, you'll have an opportunity to go and read certain things, look at another playlist that is on YouTube, or go even in further depth into the True Crime Rocket Science analysis. But for right now, let's get started. Now, just as I did with the interview that Burke Ramsey did on Dr. Phil, I basically provided you with a broader context to that, the timing of it, and the reasons for it, or the reasons behind it. And I want to do something similar in terms of the mise en scène of the Ramsey case overall. When we talk about the mise en scène, we are talking about a couple of things. It could be staging. So mise en scène could be setting the stage for something, and bear in mind, the case of JonBenet is about setting up the scene all over again. It is about recreating what you can see in the crime scene photos. It is getting a sense of the vibe of the Ramsey home, the clutter, the chaos, the untidiness, the labyrinth, the sense of how many rooms there are, and how dark and sort of cluttered some of them are, and then also what it is like standing in there. You're getting a different sense of what is going on. But what we're talking about here is investigators recreating a scene. Now think about the two ends of the spectrum. The one end of the spectrum is you might want to misdirect, for example, through a ransom note. You might want to cover up something. You might want to conceal evidence. You might want to move evidence. You might want to do all of those things. That's the one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is where you recreate the stage, right, many years later. And the idea to do that is to bring the past back to life, because obviously you can't go into the Ramsey home today, and even if you could, it's nothing like it was, so there wouldn't be too much point in doing that. Incidentally, you can go through there's some incredible video footage of the empty shell of the Ramsey house. You can get a sense through that of what the rooms are like. And that is one thing that I want to deal with on Patreon, is going into one particular room in the Ramsey home that very few investigators have done. There's very little footage of it as well. I'm not talking about the wine cellar. There's one particular room that I want to demystify, because it's one of the rooms that we think we know and we just don't. And so what all of that is about is the mise en scène is about stage setting, right? But it can also be something else. It can be the arrangement of actors and scenery on a stage for a theatrical production, right? So you might not think of the interview of Burke Ramsey on Dr. Phil as being something like that, as an arrangement of actors or as scenery on a stage. But what is quite interesting in that interview is that is not done inside the Ramsey home, and yet you've got details like portraits, framed portraits on a table, lounge table in the background. It's slightly out of focus, but those are from the original portraits showing, for example, Burke Ramsey with his sister. So it's trying to create a trustworthy, credible, respectable, dignified vibe for this family, right? But it is still quite a theatrical production, because at the same time that things are said, there are literally recreation reenactments in the Dr. Phil thing. And one of the things that I failed to mention, just because I didn't deal with that much of the Dr. Phil episode, I could do probably a series of 5 or 10 episodes just dealing with that. But one thing that was really interesting in the Dr. Phil reenactment is in the reenactment you see the parents actually handling the note, and I don't think that happened. And it's hard to say whether that is something that is just assumed or whether someone was being mischievous and trying to present something in a way that there's certainly no evidence of that. The fact that there are no fingerprints on the ransom note suggests that not only did the Ramseys not handle it, but neither did the policemen. The police that entered found the ransom note on the floor. Odd place to leave it, isn't it? Another interpretation for mise en scène is the physical setting of an action. So this is giving you a sense of, again, the tone, the context for a drama. And, there are various movies where you can feel that even just when you say the name, whether it's Forrest Gump, whether it is Saving Private Ryan, whether it is that excellent movie called 300, each one's got a texture about it. And the same applies to the Ramsey case. And so there's a mise en scène about the intruder narrative. And, when you think about the intruder narrative, you think about the broken window, you think about the suitcase, you think about the wine cellar, you think about Lou Smith, you think about pedophiles and stun guns and all that kind of thing. And that is a substantial narrative, and that is a narrative I've hardly spent any time on. So there's a huge part of the JonBenét Ramsey narrative. I wouldn't be surprised if it's the bulk of it, is this the intruder narrative. It's certainly something that has been reinforced again and again, especially in the many A&E documentaries, but and also the many interviews that the Ramseys consented to. But the counter narrative, the other mise en scène, is a scenario where there was no intruder, there was no footprints in the snow, and something else happened. And so that is the value of the case of JonBenét Ramsey, that documentary. It's providing another narrative, another scenario to the intruder narrative, and for the first time in a long time. And given what happened to the production, I think you can easily imagine that you won't have another documentary like that, in that vein, with that vibe, with that mise en scène, for at least another 10 years, 20 years, and perhaps maybe ever, right? So, but just seen in isolation, what I'm trying to show you is you've got the one mise en scène of the intruder narrative, and that talks about all sorts of things. That the duct tape is from this killer, and there's a garrote, and this guy wrote the ransom note in the house, and he skulked around, and this and that and the next thing. That gives a certain vibe to us. The other one is totally different. It's a totally different scenario. And we're going to be dealing with that to some extent through the case of JonBenét Ramsey. Something else that I think is probably just worth mentioning is another interpretation for mise en scène is environment or milieu, right? It is giving a sense of the setting. So although you can talk about staging and context or the arrangement of actors, it can also just be the environment. What was Boulder like in 1996, meaning the fabric of the justice system? What was going on with the district attorney's office? What is going on with law enforcement? And there's some very interesting topics to talk about there. The JonBenét Ramsey crime was the first murder to happen in Boulder in 1996. And so why on earth would you have homicide cops or homicide detectives in a town that doesn't have any homicides, right? So that's, I think, one way to look at it. The other thing that I think is quite ironic and that I think not too many people have thought about is I'm not sure it's necessarily true that JonBenet was murdered, right? Let me say that again. I'm not sure that it's necessarily true that JonBenet was actually murdered. And what I mean by that is that there wasn't necessarily intent to kill her, that whoever killed her didn't necessarily intend for her to die. Now you might say that's ridiculous. You might say you can see clear intent in the garrote, right? And that's not a bad argument. The counter argument to that is that it's not a garrote, first of all, and second of all, the person who constructed the toggle rope, or whatever you want to call it, this instrument, didn't intend to use it as a garrote, number one, and number two, it was more effective than what was expected, and as a result of this, what was done couldn't be undone. In other words, it was a knot that could only tighten, you couldn't loosen it. And there were a couple of things that aggravated this, such as JonBenet's gold necklace, the chain of it getting ensnared in the nylon cord along with some of her hair. And this may have made it more difficult to get something under it, like the blade of a knife or your fingers or any other object, right? So I'm going to explain in a little bit more detail what I'm talking about there, but that is, to their credit, one of the things that comes up in the case of JonBenet is that they say the person who killed JonBenet didn't do it on purpose, that it was done by accident. And I find that even more incredible is the fact that their accusation isn't that somebody murdered JonBenet. It's not that severe, right? So their accusation is that somebody accidentally killed JonBenet, right? And despite that, despite making it a relatively light crime, it's certainly a lot lighter than murder, the makers of this documentary were nevertheless the recipients of a $750 million lawsuit. Now, just think about that. A lot of people have been accusing the Ramseys of murder, including John, including Patsy. And now what is going on here, there's an accusation not even of murder, it's of something was done by accident, and then you have this incredible response to shut down this documentary. Don't you find that quite crazy? Don't you find that quite incredible if you think about it like that? Now, I think if you've never watched the case of JonBenet Ramsey, if you can't watch it for whatever reason, then what I would suggest you do, if you really want to watch it and you want to get an idea of what all the fuss is about, then go and read Foreign Faction by James Kolar. It's quite a thick book. I mean, it is really, it's over 400 pages. It's got quite a few photos in it, and it's worth reading. I think it's got even more reviews than both Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, Steve Thomas's book. So both those books have got fewer reviews than Foreign Faction, and then even the Ramsey's book, The Death of Innocence, has less reviews than Foreign Faction. I beg your pardon, I've just had a look at the pages on Amazon, and I see Steve Thomas's book has got by far the most reviews at 601, about 150 more than Foreign Faction. I do think it's interesting that the Ramsey's book has got less than 200 reviews, and it shows, I think, perhaps a lack of interest in the Ramsey side of the story, which I think kind of makes sense because they've told their stories so often in the media. And I think what this suggests is that the public might want to know the story besides from the Ramseys. That's certainly what the reviews seem to suggest. Even Paula Woodward's book, which is basically the Ramsey story just told through a different author, gets about a third as many reviews as Steve Thomas's book, which I think is interesting. Almost exactly the same amount of reviews as The Death of Innocence. So the point that I'm trying to make here is, if you're curious about the story that the documentary is based on, then you might want to go and read Foreign Faction. Also go and read JonBenét Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation. As far as I'm concerned, it's also worth reading The Death of Innocence, not so much to be necessarily convinced by it, but to get the other side of the story and to see how much of it you find believable and how much of it contradicts other things. And also to look at what has been said by the Ramseys over the years that differs from what is in their book. So what the Ramseys say and then what differs from their book. And I mean, one example is what is said about the bicycles in that book, and then what is said in subsequent interviews, such as on Dr. Phil. So I'm going to play another short clip from what Detective Kolar says about what he believed happened. A very short clip from the CBS documentary, and then I'm going to go through a couple of things that I think are credit to the documentary, right? And then as we go over to the Patreon side, I'm going to look at the things that just don't make any sense. Now, you can actually read this yourself. I'll put a link to a blog post that I wrote some time ago. So you can, those who don't want to go to Patreon, you can go to crimerocket.com and you can read some of the criticisms there, right? And you can actually, if you look at the right-hand margin of that blog post, you can access some of the books I've written on JonBenét Ramsey in that right-hand margin. But now let's listen into Kolar talking about his theory.
Patsy remained downstairs with Burke and served him the tea and the pineapple. I think that accounts for the physical evidence as well as the latent prints. Then I think she got JonBenét up to make sure she used the toilet so she didn't wet the bed that night. JonBenét was up. She may or may not have brushed her teeth. That stuff was out on the counter. And then I think she was up and awake enough that she maybe was still hungry, and she went downstairs. In the meantime, Patsy continued packing for the Michigan trip. I think if Burke was upset about circumstances or Christmas presents, he probably would have been upset about her trying to snag a piece of pineapple out of anger.
So what's interesting in this scenario is JonBenét is in bed, she's asleep, and then the next thing, everyone's awake. JonBenét's awake, Burke's awake, Patsy's also awake. And we're going to talk about that in some more detail. I agree with Kolar that I think the idea that the children slept soundly through the whole night, I think, is not likely. We know that the children actually had trouble sleeping, and I think on Christmas Day and at the end of Christmas Day, I don't think it would be a case that they would want to go to sleep. I think it would be a case that they would want to play. And especially if they were used to going to bed when it suited them, you can imagine them staying up till the very last moment. But I must say, I'm not sure if I agree with Kolar in terms of any of the children being put to bed that night. In the same way that their bedwetting wasn't dealt with, I kind of get the feeling that them put into bed wasn't necessarily the case. It's difficult to say. The other thing that he doesn't really mention is, if Patsy was downstairs giving Burke food, well, did she then return upstairs to continue packing? If that's the case, well, why is there no sign of packing? I mean, the family of four were going to go on quite a long holiday, and you would imagine not only clothing would need to be packed, but also the Christmas gifts for the other children, for Melinda and John Andrew. So where's that? Where's the packing for the trip? And my impression is that the packing didn't take place. And perhaps Patsy meant to do that first thing the next morning. I get the feeling that she was quite tired. I could be wrong. You could say that some of the bags, paper bags and plastic bags that had clothing in it, that was meant for the aeroplane. Sorry, I don't believe that. It's possible that that's the case. I think Patsy said something like, we would put things in, I think, garbage bags so that they'd be soft, so that you could just throw them into the aeroplane and that kind of thing. That's possible, but I'm not sure I believe that. I'm not sure I believe that the Ramseys would travel in that way, given how Patsy herself would dress and the pageantry involved. I would imagine going to an airport, boarding a plane, even if it's a private plane, disembarking you would be dressed quite well, especially around Christmas and going on a holiday. And what about the travel after that? What about suitcases that, bear in mind they were going to go on a cruise? What about the suitcases needed for that? So I'm not sure if I agree that Patsy was upstairs packing, and I think it's important to say, well, if she wasn't upstairs packing, what else could she have been doing? But I think that is a separate story. So briefly, I want to run through some of the things that I think are credit to the documentary. After the break, I will go through my criticisms of the actual scenario in detail. But I think the first thing to mention is I think it is important that Patsy's ovarian cancer be contextualized. I think it's important to look at the time frame of when it happened and where the lives of her children were when it happened. So, for example, how old was Burke when Patsy basically fell out of the equation, where she became an absent mother, not because she was neglectful or because she was selfish or something, but because she was fighting for her life, right? So at one point, in terms of Burke, she was a doting mother and had a lot of energy and had a lot of life. And then not long after John Bonet was born, his mother disappeared and she was fighting for her life. She was not always home. She was sometimes being treated in a hospital, not even in Boulder, and they would sometimes visit her there. And so you had a situation where early on in their lives, their mother was absent for lengths of time. And then later on in their lives, their father was absent for lengths of time as he was getting his business up and running. And I think it's quite important to contextualize that aspect. Just before the 5-minute mark, Laura Richards talks about we need to understand them as people, meaning the Ramseys. And that is so true. We need to understand John Ramsey as a person, not as a cardboard cutout figure. Where did he come from? Does he have siblings? How many marriages was he in? What was his attitude to life coming from a somewhat military background? Was he a scout? Why might he have an interest in, when he married Patsy, she was quite a much younger wife, and what impact would that have? Being in a second marriage, you've already had children, and that is something Laura Richards also mentions, Patsy's age and John's age, and the fact that these were effectively his fourth and fifth children, right, in his second marriage. And I think that does have an impact. If you have children later in life, it's going to have an impact. Your priorities may have shifted. And it may also be that Patsy took her cue from John. If John wasn't that hands-on with the family, she may have also felt, well, I also want to be entrepreneurial. I also want to run charities. I also want to have social engagements, whatever. Something as sort of basic as picking up poop, someone else can do. I'm not going to do that. The housekeeper can do that. I'm not going to deal with that. I'm going to deal with the other side of the parenting, the fun side. I'll leave the drudgery to, I guess, the housekeeper. That may have been how Patsy read it. And then there's also Burke's backstory. What is it like for him when his mother got cancer? What was his relationship with his mother like when he was John Bonet's age? What was going on there? And I think that's something that's not often spoken about when we talk about the Ramsey case. And then the same thing with John Bonet. How old was she when her mother got cancer? And you can imagine if John Bonet kind of loses her mother while her mother's still alive for a while, and then her mother comes back, and then her mother turns John Bonet into a project, and there are all these pageants. You can imagine this elastic band, from the mother falling away and then coming back and being so involved in her life in terms of the pageant mise-en-scène, right? That would have been quite fun and exciting for John Bonet. But where's Burke going to fit into that scenario? So something else that I appreciated in the case of John Bonet Ramsey is the discussion, the analysis around the audio at the end of the 911 call. Now, I remember Lynn Wood criticized the documentary saying, well, there's nothing new in it, and in a way I can agree that maybe 80% of what came out in the documentary wasn't something that hadn't been brought up, for example, at various times in Steve Thomas's book. So, but the emphasis had shifted to some extent. What I found definitely interesting was, I don't know if I'd heard some of these recordings before. I'd heard people talking about them, but I can't say I'd really heard them. I'm not sure if it makes much of a difference when you do hear them, because you don't really, I think you can hear whatever you want to through the scratchy, high-pitched digital jangling and through the static. You can really hear whatever you want to hear. But what is interesting is that I think they interviewed the 911 operator, and she said, although the recording is not very clear, she could clearly hear voices. And I think that is pretty incredible. Something else that comes up in the documentary is the idea of Patsy making the 911 call and then hanging up. She hangs up on the police operator, right? And if you think about it, there's a similarity in a broad sense to the ransom note. And what I mean by that is, and again, this is if you imagine that Patsy wrote the ransom note. So, Patsy makes the 911 call and then hangs up on her own call, asking for help, right? In the ransom note, you have a situation where a message is communicated, right? And then when Patsy and John are confronted with this message, in this mise-en-scène, you kind of have a thing of hanging up on the ransom note as well. You don't handle it, you don't really pay attention to it, you don't follow the instructions in it. And so that's giving you a sense of that pageantry, which is you don't take the pageantry seriously, right? It's not real. So something that comes up at about 11, 12 minutes in the documentary is the analysis of the static, and you can see and hear how the noise is reduced. And certainly what I find interesting, personally, I don't hear that, but it's almost like as soon as somebody says something, then you do hear it. So it's quite difficult to know what to think about that subjectively or objectively. You can't tell what the squiggly sound is, but then when someone says it's that, well, then that's what you hear. So it's difficult to say if there's cognitive bias going on or not. But what is alleged in the documentary is that a man's voice can be heard saying, "We are not talking to you." And then what is suggested is that a voice says, "What did you do?" and another one says, "Help me, Jesus." So it's difficult to make much out of this, but it certainly, in a way, opens a door to all sorts of thoughts and ideas, doesn't it? So something else that was really well done was actually finding the 911 call operator, and she actually says something completely different to what they think that they hear. It's not clear whether this was not recorded in the recording, but she says that it sounded like someone on the other end said, okay, I've called the police, now what? Right? And to be honest, I would think that what she's saying is more credible than trying to decipher the digital gibberish, right? It is also interesting, and I'm sure that you could find 20 prosecution witnesses in the same way you could find 20 defense witnesses. But what is interesting is that the 911 call operator said something didn't feel right, right? And, it's possible that she felt that way 6 months later or 5 years later or whatever, but it's also possible that she felt like that immediately. We don't know. We would have to ask her that, and one would have to ask her that to get that kind of detail. Unfortunately, the people talking to her didn't, dig that deeply. She also said she stayed on the phone because, and this is after Patsy hung up, because she thought that they might talk to her again, and she said she thought she overheard 2 voices in the room, maybe 3. The other thing that she says that I think's incredible, it's incredible if it's true, is that she said her impression of the 911 call, and I guess it's how she felt at the time, it does seem as though that is what she's talking about, and how she's felt for the past 20 to 25 years, is that she said the 911 call to her seemed rehearsed. It didn't seem spontaneous. It didn't seem as though Patsy was talking in a genuine way. It seemed to be based on a script, that Patsy was going to say a certain kind of thing and then she was going to hang up, and that's what she did. What's also established, and this is around about 18 and a half minutes in to the first part of the first episode, is that Marcelletta wasn't called to testify to the grand jury, and that is definitely quite interesting. It's definitely quite interesting that she wasn't even called. She said she really felt strongly, she wanted justice for this case, and during this discussion, one of the hosts of the show says something along the lines that they thought that they heard a boy saying, "What did you find?" And obviously in a mise en scène where there's a ransom note, you can kind of imagine he'd be, what's this all about? What's this about a ransom note? He's heard something about that. And what I want you to try and do, and I'm not going to do it here, but is play the 911 call and imagine a situation where you are in the house, you aren't Patsy or John, and you're hearing the 911 call and you're like, what's this? What are you talking about? And then could a response to that have been, we're not talking to you, and what have you done?
I had an investigator come to my house, told me there's a gag order, do not talk about this until we go to court, and I never was talked to again.
Now what's quite interesting is just after this moment where Archuleta talks about it, and she said she had a bad feeling about it and she really did want to testify, she wanted to be involved, and she was kind of blocked, kept out of everything, she actually starts crying. And you get a sense through her of people on the periphery of this case that are nevertheless part of it, that are silently looking on, helplessly, feeling like I want to help, but someone is holding them back. And then the question is who and why? So see, we're approaching 40 minutes. I've really not touched on very much here, but I'm going to call it the end of this episode for those folks on YouTube. The last thing I want to mention before we move on is just to highlight something that Kim Archuleta mentioned. That's the 911 call operator. She was saying that her impression of this 911 call was that it was rehearsed. Now, if you take that a little bit further, what is she saying? She's saying it didn't sound genuine. It didn't sound authentic, right? It wasn't the most authentic voice in a 911 call, okay? Now, if you take that supposition, and that's really all it is, it's a theory, and you look at Patsy's background as, I think she was involved in drama, or what do they call them when you do speech contests, something like that. I think she did that as part of her studies when she was studying at university. But the other thing is that she was involved in pageants, and so was JonBenet, and she was involved in managing JonBenet in pageants. And what is often part of that is rehearsing what you're going to say, so that you're going to come off convincing, that people are going to not just accept but like, and it's going to have a certain impact on your audience. And so there's something that fits with this idea of the 911 call being rehearsed, in the same way that the ransom note may have been not rehearsed but a practice note, right? Because that is what goes into pageants, is practicing and rehearsing, getting your lines right. Does that make sense? I'll be back tomorrow for episode 50 in the ongoing series, and bear in mind there'll also be a live stream on Sunday, that's Valentine's Day, where if you've got any questions, you're welcome to let me know. I'll also put a link to where you can watch the case of JonBenet. I don't know if it's available in all countries, but I'll put a link to that in the description. Okay, so have a good weekend, a safe weekend. Happy Valentine's Day for Sunday, and I'll see you guys next time. Patsy Ramsey died on the 24th of June 2006, and about 3 days later an article appeared in The Guardian which spoke about her backstory, spoke about her being born to an engineer father and an ambitious mother in Parkersburg.